In April 2024, a gold pocket watch sold at auction for over 1 million British pounds. The initials engraved on its case were simple, J.J.A. 3 letters, that once belonged to the richest man aboard the most famous shipwreck in history. That watch stopped ticking in the early hours of April 15th, 1912. Its owner had just placed his pregnant teenage bride into a lifeboat. He asked if he could join her. The answer was no. John Jacob Astor IV possessed a fortune estimated at $87 million. In today's currency, that approaches $3 billion. He could have purchased the entire White Star Line and still have money left over. He owned hotels that defined luxury. He had invented machines and written novels about the future. His mother had dictated the terms of American high society for nearly 40 years. None of it mattered in the North Atlantic that night. This is not simply a story about the Titanic. The ship appears only at the end. Before that cold April night, there was a dynasty built from nothing by a German immigrant. There was a mother who decided who belonged in New York society and who did not. There was a son caught between expectations and his own unconventional mind. There was a scandalous divorce, a teenage bride, and a wedding that respectable clergy refused to perform. The Astors were American royalty. Their name adorned hotels, streets, and libraries across New York. Their wealth shaped the skyline of Manhattan. And in 1912, the heir to all of it stood on a tilting deck and watched his wife disappear into the darkness. If you find value in stories like this one, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, let us begin where the Astor fortune itself began, with a young man from a German village who crossed the Atlantic carrying little more than ambition. Chapter 1. The Fur Trader's Dream. The first John Jacob Astor arrived in America with almost nothing, a few coins, some flutes to sell, and an ambition that would reshape New York City forever. He was born Johann Jakob Astor in 1763 in the small village of Waldorf near Heidelberg. His father butchered meat for a living. The family was respectable but poor. Young Johann showed little interest in following his father's trade. At 16, he left for London to join his brother in manufacturing musical instruments. 4 years later, he boarded a ship for the newly independent United States. The crossing took months. During the voyage, Astor met a fellow passenger who traded in furs. The man explained how beaver pelts commanded high prices in Europe, where fashion demanded them for hats. Astor listened carefully. By the time he reached New York in 1784, he had already decided to abandon the flute business. He started small, working for a fur dealer, learning the trade, and making contacts with trappers and Native American suppliers in upstate New York. Within a few years, he opened his own shop. His wife, Sarah, ran the store while he traveled into the wilderness to negotiate directly with trappers. Astor possessed two qualities that separated him from other merchants. First, he understood that controlling the entire supply chain meant controlling the profits. He did not simply buy and sell furs. He established trading posts, hired his own agents, and eventually owned the ships that carried his goods to Europe and China. Second, he recognized an opportunity before others did. The Jay Treaty of 1794 opened British-controlled territory around the Great Lakes to American traders. Astor moved immediately. Within a decade, his American Fur Company dominated the industry from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest. The town of Astoria in Oregon still bears his name. He founded it in 1811 as a trading outpost at the mouth of the Columbia River. It became the first permanent American settlement on the Pacific coast. His vision extended across an entire continent, but Astor was not sentimental about fur. When beaver populations declined and European fashion shifted toward silk hats in the 1830s, he saw the change coming. He sold his fur interests and redirected his capital toward something more permanent, land, specifically Manhattan. His brother Henry had urged him to invest in New York real estate as early as 1799. Astor bought his first parcel of Manhattan property that year. Over the following decades, he accumulated more. He purchased the Richmond Hill estate from Aaron Burr after Burr's finances collapsed following the duel with Alexander Hamilton. He bought farmland in what is now Greenwich Village in Midtown. He acquired entire blocks. Astor rarely developed his properties himself. Instead, he leased the land to others who built homes and businesses on it. When the leases expired, typically after 21 years, everything on the land belonged to him. The buildings, the improvements, all of it. New York grew exactly as he had predicted. Immigration surged. The population pushed northward up the island. Land that had been considered too far from the city center became prime real estate. Astor's holdings multiplied in value without him lifting a finger. By the 1840s, he was the wealthiest person in the United States. Some estimates placed his holdings at around $20 million. That represented roughly 1% of the entire American economy at the time. No individual before him had accumulated such a proportion of national wealth. Adjusted for economic scale, his fortune dwarfs those of modern billionaires. When he died in March 1848, newspapers struggled to quantify his estate. He left $400,000 to establish what became the Astor Library, later merged into the New York Public Library. He sent $50,000 back to his hometown of Waldorf for a poorhouse and orphanage. The bulk of his estate, however, passed to his children. His son, William Backhouse Astor, expanded the real estate empire further, constructing hundreds of buildings across New York. The family's grip on Manhattan tightened with each generation. They became landlords to tens of thousands. Their name appeared on hotels, theaters, and apartment buildings throughout the city. The Astors had arrived at the pinnacle of American wealth, but money alone did not guarantee social acceptance in the rigid hierarchies of 19th century New York. Old Knickerbocker families descended from the original Dutch settlers looked down upon mere wealth. To stand at the apex of New York society would require something more. It would require a queen. And in 1853, William Backhouse Astor Jr. married a woman who intended to become exactly that. Chapter 2. The Queen of Fifth Avenue. Caroline Schermerhorn understood something that mere millionaires did not. Money could buy mansions and jewels and carriages, but it could not buy social acceptance. That required bloodlines, manners, and above all, the right arbiter to decide who belonged. She intended to become that arbiter. Born in 1830 to one of New York's oldest Dutch families, Caroline possessed what the heirs lacked. The Schermerhorns traced their American roots to the original settlers of New Amsterdam. They were nicer, part of the quiet aristocracy that had governed New York society for generations. They did not need to prove their standing. It was inherited. When Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. in 1853, she brought respectability to the Astor name. The heirs had more money than almost anyone, but the original John Jacob had been an immigrant, a fur trader, a man who reportedly wiped his hands on the tablecloth at dinner parties. His descendants needed polish. Caroline provided it. The marriage was practical rather than passionate. William proved more interested in horses, yachts, and time away from home than in social climbing. He eventually owned the largest private yacht in America and spent months aboard it each year, often in the company of guests his wife preferred not to acknowledge. Caroline smiled and remarked that the sea air was beneficial for dear William's health. If she could not control her husband, she would control everything else. Throughout the 1860s and 70s, Caroline assembled the machinery of social power. She cultivated relationships with the right families. She hosted dinners of precise formality. She dressed expensively but conservatively, favoring dark colors and spectacular diamonds. Her portrait, painted by Carolus Duran, shows a woman of severe dignity. No warmth, no vulnerability, only authority. Her key ally was Ward Mallister, a Southern-born lawyer who had reinvented himself as a professional social organizer. Mallister understood the mechanics of exclusivity. Together, they developed the concept that would define Gilded Age New York, the 400. The name supposedly derived from the capacity of Caroline's ballroom at her mansion on Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. Whether this origin is accurate or simply a convenient legend remains unclear. What mattered was the principle. New York contained thousands of prosperous families by the 1880s. Industrialists and railroad magnates flooded into the city, building enormous houses, throwing extravagant parties, and demanding recognition. Caroline's response was to draw a line. Only 400 people, she and Mallister declared, truly constituted New York society. Everyone else, regardless of their millions, remained outside. The criteria were deliberately vague. Old family connections mattered. Proper behavior mattered. Knowing the right people mattered. But ultimately, Caroline decided her judgment was final. Her annual ball became the most anticipated event of the social calendar. Held on the third Monday of January each year, an invitation confirmed your place among the chosen. Exclusion meant irrelevance. Hostesses across the city planned their entire seasons around it, terrified of scheduling conflicts that might suggest they did not expect to be invited. The press called her simply Mrs. Astor. Other women held the name through marriage. She held it through sheer force of will. When her nephew William Waldorf Astor attempted to position his own wife as the true Mrs. Astor, arguing that as the eldest son's eldest son, he held seniority, Caroline simply ignored him. William Waldorf eventually gave up and moved to England. She had outlasted him without raising her voice. Her methods could be brutal. Families who violated her standards found themselves excluded not just from her ballroom, but from every drawing room that mattered. A single misstep, a marriage to the wrong person, an association with someone unacceptable could end a social career permanently. She wielded this power carefully, but absolutely. For the better part of 40 years, nothing significant happened in the city's upper circles without her approval. Caroline and William had 5 children together, 4 daughters and 1 son. The daughters married appropriately into families that met their mother's standards. The son, born in 1864, was named John Jacob Astor IV after his great-grandfather. As the only male heir, he would eventually inherit not just the family business, but the weight of the Astor name itself. Caroline doted on her boy. She called him Jack. She dressed him in fine clothes and enrolled him in the best schools. She expected him to take his place at the head of New York society when the time came. But Jack Astor was not like his mother. Where she was controlled and commanding, he was awkward and introspective. Where she mastered social ritual, he preferred tinkering with mechanical devices and imagining futures that did not yet exist. The heir to America's most prominent social dynasty would prove to be profoundly uncomfortable in the world his mother had created. Chapter 3. The Heir. The newspapers did not know what to make of him. Here was the only son of the most powerful hostess in America, heir to one of the largest fortunes on the continent, and he seemed to care more about gears and pulleys than ballrooms and dinner parties. Some journalists called him Jack Astor. The cruel pun stuck. John Jacob Astor IV was born on July 13, 1864, at Ferncliff, the family's country estate in Rhinebeck, New York. He arrived as the 5th child and only son. His 4 older sisters had already claimed their mother's attention. Jack would carry a different burden. The Astor name, the Astor business, the Astor legacy. All of it would fall to him. His education followed the expected path. St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, and then Harvard. He moved through these institutions without distinction, a tall and ungainly young man who struggled with the easy social confidence that wealth usually provided. Classmates remembered him as quiet, somewhat odd, more interested in how things worked than in who knew whom. Where his mother saw networks of influence, Jack saw systems and mechanisms. Where she cultivated relationships, he sketched designs. The social machinery that Caroline had spent decades perfecting held no fascination for her son. He wanted to build actual machines. In 1891, at the age of 26, Jack married Ava Lowell Willing of Philadelphia. She was beautiful, cultured, and socially accomplished. Caroline approved. The match seemed appropriate. But we will return to that marriage and its eventual collapse. For now, what matters is that even domestic life could not settle Jack's restless mind. 3 years after his wedding, he published a novel. This alone would have raised eyebrows. Heirs managed property. They did not write fiction. But the book itself proved even more surprising. A journey in other worlds imagined the year 2000. Spacecraft powered by a force called apogee traveled between planets. Characters explored Jupiter and Saturn. The Earth had been transformed by technology, its climate altered, its continents connected. Critics were puzzled. The pros were serviceable. the science fanciful, the philosophy muddled with spiritualism. But scattered throughout were predictions that would later seem premonitory. Airship crossing the Atlantic, screens displaying moving images, a planet warming from human industry. Whether Jack possessed genuine foresight or simply a restless imagination, the novel revealed a mind that operated far outside the expected boundaries of Gilded Age aristocracy. He followed the book with patents, a bicycle brake in 1898, a pneumatic device for improving road surfaces, and a vibratory disintegrator that could produce gas from peat moss. He contributed to the development of turbine engines. None of these inventions made him famous. None of them needed to. He had more money than he could ever spend. What he lacked was purpose. The Spanish-American War provided it. When war broke out in 1898, Jack did not simply write a check or attend patriotic rallies. He financed and equipped an entire volunteer artillery battery. The unit became known as the Astor Battery. He outfitted them with the finest equipment his money could buy and arranged for their deployment to the Philippines. Then he went further. He applied for a military commission himself. The Army appointed him lieutenant colonel in the United States Volunteers. He served on the staff of Major General William Shaft during the Santiago campaign in Cuba. He placed his yacht, the Normahal, at the disposal of the federal government. He even appeared in 2 motion pictures documenting the war effort. None of this was required. He could have remained in Newport or Manhattan, hosting dinners and reading newspapers like other men of his class. Instead, he chose heat and disease and the possibility of Spanish bullets. The man who fumbled at dinner parties performed competently under military discipline. Structure suited him better than society. After the war ended, the Army promoted him to the rank of colonel in recognition of his service. For the rest of his life, he preferred to be called Colonel Astor. The title represented something he had earned rather than inherited. He returned to civilian life decorated but unfulfilled. The hotels and real estate that constituted the family business occupied his attention without capturing his passion. He continued to invent, to invest, to manage. He remained among the wealthiest men in the country, and his marriage was falling apart. Chapter 4. The Hotel King. The feud between the Astor cousins played out in brick and mortar. William Waldorf Astor, Jack's older cousin, had long resented his position in the family. As the son of the eldest son, he believed himself the rightful head of the American heirs. Caroline disagreed. She had spent decades establishing herself as Mrs. Astor, and no nephew would displace her. William Waldorf's response was architectural spite. In 1893, he demolished his father's mansion on 5th Avenue and 33rd Street and erected a massive hotel on the site. He named it the Waldorf after the German village where the dynasty had begun. The structure rose directly beside Caroline's home, casting shadows across her windows, flooding her street with commercial traffic. It was an insult disguised as an investment. Caroline refused to be outdone. She abandoned her brownstone and moved uptown to a new mansion at 65th Street. Jack, meanwhile, saw an opportunity where his mother saw a fence. In 1897, he razed Caroline's former home and constructed his own hotel adjoining his cousin's. He called it the Atoria. The 2 buildings are connected through a corridor that journalists dubbed Peacock Alley, 300 feet of marble and mirrors, where the fashionable paraded each afternoon. The combined Waldorf Hotel became the largest and most celebrated hotel in New York. 1,000 rooms, a ballroom that seated 1,500. Guests included presidents, foreign dignitaries, and anyone who could afford the rates. The cousins never reconciled personally. William Waldorf eventually renounced his American citizenship and moved to England, where he purchased a title and became Viscount Astor. But their hotels remained joined. The hyphen between Waldorf and Atoria represented a truce neither man would acknowledge in conversation. Jack had proven he could match his cousin. Now he wanted to surpass him entirely. The St. Regis Hotel opened on September 4th, 1904, at 5th Avenue and 55th Street. Jack had spent $5.5 million on construction and furnishings. The name reportedly came from his niece Helen, who suggested the lake in the Adirondacks, where the family often vacationed. Jack intended to create something unprecedented, not merely a hotel, but a private residence for travelers who expected the comforts of a well-appointed home. Every detail reflected his engineering mind. Each room contained a telephone, still a novelty in most buildings. A fire alarm system is connected on every floor. Central heating kept guests warm without the mess of individual fireplaces. Most remarkably, Jack designed an air cooling system that allowed guests to adjust the temperature of their own rooms. Modern air conditioning did not yet exist. His solution used fans, ice, and ductwork to circulate cooled air throughout the structure. It worked. He installed mail chutes on every floor, a convenience that made headlines at the time. He created a central vacuum system. Maids simply plugged their cleaning hoses into wall sockets rather than hauling heavy equipment from room to room. He specified French marble throughout the corridors and stairways because he considered Italian marble too common for his purposes. The hotel attracted precisely the clientele Jack had envisioned: families who spent entire seasons in residence, foreign visitors who expected European standards of service, and guests who appreciated innovation as much as elegance. Salvador Dali would later live there for years. So would Marlene Dietrich and the broadcasting executive William Paley. The King Cole Bar, with its famous Maxfield Parrish mural, became a gathering place for those who shaped opinion and policy. Jack raised one more hotel, the Knickerbocker, which opened in 1906 at Broadway and 42nd Street. It catered to the theater district, drawing actors and impresarios to its restaurant and bar. The tenor Enrico Caruso kept a permanent suite there and reportedly stored his personal collection of signed photographs in its walls. 3 major hotels in less than a decade, each profitable, each bearing the Astor imprint of practical innovation wrapped in understated elegance. His mother had commanded the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. He had constructed the rooms themselves. Yet hotels could not hold his attention forever. By the time the Knickerbocker opened, his marriage had collapsed entirely. Ava had moved to Europe years earlier. Newspapers speculated about the reasons, affairs, and incompatibility. The couple had lived separate lives for so long that the legal dissolution seemed almost redundant. In 1909, Ava returned to New York and filed for divorce. The scandal would have destroyed a lesser family. For the heirs, it was merely the beginning. Chapter 5. The First Mrs. Astor. Their incompatibility was obvious from the start. Ava Lowell Willing came from old Philadelphia money, the kind that traced back to colonial times. Her ancestor, Thomas Willing, had served as president of the First Bank of the United States. The Willings possessed what the heirs had spent generations trying to acquire: pedigree. She was 22 when she married Jack in February of 1891. The wedding took place at her parents' mansion on South Broad Street in Philadelphia. She was considered a great beauty of her generation. Dark hair, striking features, a commanding presence in any room she entered. Jack was 26, awkward, and so nervous at social gatherings that he struggled to make conversation. The mismatch became apparent almost immediately. Where Jack preferred solitary evenings and mechanical drawings, Ava craved attention and admiration. She possessed sharp wit and a sharper tongue, and she used both freely. Acquaintances would later recall that she mocked her husband openly, calling him stupid in front of guests. Jack trailed after her at parties. One observer noted, like a lost dog. He could not match her appetite for the social world. She gave him 2 children. Vincent arrived in November of 1891, just 9 months after the wedding. A daughter, Ava Alice Murrell, followed more than a decade later in July of 1902. The long gap between children suggested what everyone already suspected. The union existed in name only. By 1896, Ava had established herself in London. She acquired a townhouse on Grosvenor Square and a country estate at Regent's Park. She moved through circles that included King Edward III. Rumors linked her to Winthrop Rutherford, a breathtakingly handsome New York bachelor who counted several prominent wives among his reputed conquests. Jack remained in New York, building hotels and filing patents, and raising Vincent largely on his own. The Atlantic Ocean suited both parties. In November of 1909, Ava returned to America and filed for divorce in White Plains, New York. The legal grounds were abandonment, though everyone understood the reality was far more complicated. The proceedings attracted intense press coverage despite efforts to seal the court records. Journalists speculated about affairs on both sides. Neither party would confirm or deny. 4 months later, in March of 1910, the state of New York granted the final decree. The financial settlement became a matter of confusion. Some reports claimed Ava received $10 million. Contemporary newspaper accounts indicated she accepted annual alimony of approximately $50,000, a fraction of what she had demanded. The precise figure remains uncertain. Vincent, now 18, chose to remain with his father. He would soon enter Harvard. The boy had never been close to his mother and would grow even more distant in the years to come. Young Ava Alice, only 7, went with her mother to England. Jack emerged from the divorce, embarrassed publicly, but unburdened privately. At 45, he found himself single for the first time in nearly 2 decades. His mother had died the previous year. His son would soon leave for college. The Astor holdings belonged to him, and he had no one to share them with. Ava flourished in England. She remarried in 1919, marrying Thomas Leicester, 4th Baron Ribblesdale, in a ceremony so private that even her servants were unaware of it. The title she had always craved was finally hers. Ribblesdale died 6 years later. She never married again. When she died in 1958 at the age of 89, Ava left $25,000 to her son Vincent, a token. The bulk of her estate went to her daughter's children. But all of that lay decades in the future. In the spring of 1910, Jack Astor was a divorced man approaching 50, richer than almost anyone on earth, and entirely without companionship. He would not remain so for long. Chapter 6. Malign. 17 years old. That was malign force when she first encountered Colonel Astor. He was 46. The summer of 1910 brought both of them to Bar Harbor, Maine, where the prosperous retreated each August to escape the heat of eastern cities. Jack Astor had been coming to Mount Desert Island for years. He kept a yacht in the harbor and knew most of the families who summered there. Malign Talmadge Force was new to these circles. Her family had money, but not the kind that drew notice. Her father, William, owned a successful shipping company. Her mother, Catherine, came from respectable Brooklyn stock. The Forces belonged to the comfortable upper tier of New York life without quite reaching its highest rung. Malign had graduated from Miss Spence's school in Manhattan just that spring. Tall and graceful with clear features and an easy manner, she drew people to her without apparent effort. Friends described her as unusually capable. She rode horses well, handled sailboats with confidence, and spoke passable French from childhood trips to Europe. By December, she would make her formal debut into the younger set. No one recorded the precise circumstances of their first meeting. What mattered was what followed. Jack began inviting Malign on automobile drives and afternoon cruises aboard his yacht. The press noticed. They always noticed anything involving an asterisk. By winter, the two were appearing together at dinners he hosted at the St. Regis. Speculation mounted through the spring of 1911. In April, newspapers began running headlines. New York is interested in Miss Force, one declared. Pretty girl may marry rich Mr. Astor, announced another. The stories emphasized what everyone could see. A teenager and a man nearly 3 decades her senior, a recent divorce, and a debutant younger than his own son. The combination invited comment. Jack was not deterred. Neither was Malign. On the 1st of August 1911, her father, William Force, stood on the steps of his office at 78 Front Street in Lower Manhattan. Reporters had gathered, drawn by rumors that could no longer be contained. Force confirmed what they had come to hear. His daughter and Colonel John Jacob Astor IV were engaged. No date had been set for the ceremony. The announcement ignited a firestorm. Religious leaders across the country condemned the match. Episcopal doctrine at the time prohibited remarriage after divorce. Catholic priests denounced it from their pulpits. A minister in Philadelphia delivered a sermon combining, as one newspaper put it, good canon law with railing invective against the principles. The Cincinnati Enquirer called the romance one of wicked lust. Letters arrived at the Force home threatening Malign with violence. The pressure made her physically ill. The 400 closed ranks against her. These were the families who had once gathered in Caroline A's ballroom, the arbiters of who mattered in New York. They gave Malign what the press called the cold shoulder. At gatherings where she appeared, women turned away. No one acknowledged her as a future Mrs. Astor. Some refused to believe she would ever hold the title. Jack responded with money. He reportedly purchased a $30,000 engagement ring worth nearly $1 million in today's currency. He arranged a settlement said to be worth $5 million should anything happen to him. He would build a fortress of wealth around this girl if that was what it took. But wealth could not buy acceptance, and wealth could not find them a minister willing to perform the ceremony. Chapter 7. The wedding no one would perform. They tried the Episcopalians first. It made sense. The heirs had worshipped in Episcopal churches for generations. Jack himself had been baptized and confirmed in the faith. But Episcopal doctrine in 1911 did not permit clergy to marry divorced persons whose former spouses still lived. Ava was very much alive, enjoying herself in London. The church doors closed. They approached ministers of other denominations, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, and Lutheran. One by one, each declined. Some cited religious objections to remarriage. Others simply did not want the attention. The press had turned the Astor engagement into a national spectacle. Any clergyman who agreed to officiate would face the same scrutiny, the same editorials, the same denunciations from colleagues. Weeks passed. The engagement had been announced in August. September arrived with no wedding date set and no minister secured. Newspapers tracked the search with undisguised glee. Would the richest bachelor in America be unable to find anyone willing to make Malign his wife? At one point, Jack reportedly considered a man named Edwin Straight. Straight had been ordained as a Free Baptist minister, but had since become a carpenter by trade. The press found this detail irresistible. The clerical carpenter, they called him. Whatever arrangement Jack had in mind never materialized. Finally, a name emerged. Reverend Joseph Lambert, pastor of Elwood Temple Congregational Church in Providence, Rhode Island. Lambert was willing. Some accounts suggested Jack offered him a substantial sum, reportedly around $2,000, for his services. Lambert himself declined to discuss any financial arrangements, saying only that it was nobody's business. The wedding took place on September 9, 1911, at Beechwood, Jack's oceanside estate in Newport. The ceremony began in the morning in the ballroom that had hosted countless gatherings during Jack's mother's reign. Now it held only a handful of people. No crowds, no spectators, no members of the 400 who might turn their backs on the bride. American Beauty roses filled the room. They had been Caroline A's favorite flower. Now they decorated her son's second wedding. Malign's sister Catherine served as maid of honor. On Jack's side stood his son Vincent, 19 years old, acting as best man. Vincent was barely older than his new stepmother. Whatever he thought of his father's choice, he kept to himself that morning. The ceremony itself was brief. Lambert spoke. Jack and Malign exchanged vows. Rings were placed on fingers. Within minutes, Malign Talmadge Force had become Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV. There was no elaborate reception. The newlyweds posed for photographs, accepted congratulations from the small gathering, and prepared to leave. Jack's steam yacht, Enema, waited in Newport Harbor. Within hours of becoming husband and wife, the heirs were aboard and heading out to sea. The minister did not fare as well. Within weeks, Lambert found himself at the center of a storm he had perhaps underestimated. Fellow clergy criticized his decision publicly, and his congregation was divided. In November, less than 2 months after joining the heirs, Reverend Joseph Lambert resigned his position at Elwood Temple. He never discussed what, if anything, Jack Astor had paid him. Back in New York, society continued to treat the new Mrs. Astor as an outsider. The women who had snubbed Malign before the wedding showed no signs of welcoming her afterward. She remained the young interloper who had captured a divorced man old enough to be her father. Jack understood what they faced. The whispers would not stop. The hostility would not fade. Every social event carries the risk of humiliation. There was only one solution: leave. The couple would spend their honeymoon far from anyone who might judge them. Egypt, Paris, anywhere. The name Astor did not carry decades of complicated history, and when they finally decided to return to America, they would book passage on the finest ship afloat. Chapter 8. The Escape. The NM carried them first to Rhinebeck, then south to Bermuda. For a few weeks, the newlyweds moved between places where the Astor name meant welcome rather than whispers, but they could not hide forever on the eastern seaboard. In November, word reached the press that Colonel and Mrs. Astor intended to winter abroad. In January 1912, they boarded the Olympic, the largest ocean liner in the world, and sister ship to one still under construction. The Olympic carried them across the Atlantic to begin what the newspapers would later call their Egyptian tour. Egypt offered everything America could not: distance, anonymity, ancient wonders that made even money seem small. They sailed up the Nile. They visited Cairo. They stood before the pyramids at Giza. For the first time since their engagement had been announced, no one cared who they were or what respectable people thought of their marriage. One American did seek them out. Margaret Brown was a Denver millionaire whose fortune came from mining rather than old money. Society back home considered her vulgar, too loud, too new. She had recently separated from her own husband and understood something about being unwelcome in polite circles. The three of them traveled together through Egypt, an unlikely trio bound by their shared status as outsiders. Jack relaxed in ways Moline had never seen. He pointed out engineering details in ancient structures. He sketched mechanisms. He took photographs. Away from the judgment of the 400, the awkward man she had married seemed almost at ease. Their dog, Kitty, traveled with them everywhere. The Airedale Terrier had been Jack's companion for years. At one point during the Egyptian tour, Kitty went missing. Jack searched until she was found. He could not bear to lose her. From Egypt, they moved to Paris. The city welcomed wealthy Americans without asking questions about divorce or age differences. They stayed in fine hotels. They dined in restaurants where no one turned away. They attended the theater. For a few months, they lived as any rich couple might live, unburdened by the weight of the Astor name. Then Moline realized she was pregnant. The news changed everything. Jack wanted his child born in the United States on American soil as an American citizen. There would be no question of the baby's legitimacy, no foreign birth certificate to complicate matters of inheritance. The heir to part of the Astor fortune would arrive in New York. They began making plans to return. Moline's condition required careful travel. She would need a nurse. The crossing would have to be comfortable, the accommodations superb. Jack started inquiring about the passage. A new ship was preparing for her maiden voyage. The Royal Mail steamer Titanic would depart Southampton on April 10, 1912, bound for New York. She was the largest vessel ever built, even larger than her sister, Olympic. The newspapers called her unsinkable. Her first-class suites were said to be the most luxurious afloat. Jack booked a parlor suite, cabins C62 through 64, on the starboard side, the best rooms on the best ship. They would board at Southampton, France, where the Titanic would stop to collect passengers before heading into the Atlantic. Accompanying them would be Jack's valet, Victor Robbins, Moline's maid, Rosalie Bedouin, a private nurse named Caroline Andres, and, of course, Kitty. Moline was 5 months along by then. The pregnancy was progressing well, but she was tired easily. The prospect of returning to New York brought mixed feelings. She had enjoyed their months abroad, the freedom from scrutiny, the simple pleasure of being Mrs. Astor without the complications that title carried at home. But home was where the baby would be born. Home was where they would finally have to face whatever reception awaited them. On April 10, 1912, Colonel and Mrs. John Jacob Astor boarded the Titanic at Southampton. A small boat called the Pneumatic ferried them from the harbor to the great ship anchored offshore. Moline climbed aboard carefully, one hand on her husband's arm. The ship was everything the newspapers had promised. Grand staircases, gleaming woodwork, electric lights everywhere. Their suite contained a private promenade deck where Moline could take fresh air without encountering other passengers. Jack seemed impressed by the engineering. He reportedly pointed out features of the ship's construction to anyone who would listen. "She is unsinkable," he told fellow passengers. A modern shipbuilding miracle. The crossing would take less than a week. By April 17th, they expected to be in New York. 4 days stood between them and home. Chapter 9. The unsinkable ship. The Titanic had left Southampton on April 10th with over 2,000 souls aboard. She stopped at Cherbourg that evening to collect passengers from France, then crossed to Queenstown on the Irish coast the following morning. By noon on April 11th, the coast of Ireland had faded behind her. Nothing lay ahead but open ocean and 5 days of crossing. For the heirs, those days passed without incident. The pregnancy had left Malign with little stamina. Long walks exhausted her. She spent much of her time in their suite, resting on the enclosed deck, adjoining their rooms, with salt air and solitude. Jack brought her books and sat with her. Sometimes he read aloud. When she felt strong enough, they ventured into the public spaces. The ship offered distractions that no ocean liner had provided before. A gymnasium equipped with rowing machines, cycling apparatus, and mechanical horses that simulated riding. A swimming bath filled with heated seawater. Turkish baths in the Moorish style with steam rooms and cooling chambers. A library stocked with recent novels. A barber shop. A dark room for photographers. Jack appreciated the engineering. He examined the fittings, asked questions of the officers, and studied the mechanisms that kept such a vast vessel moving through the water. The Titanic displaced over 46,000 tons. Her reciprocating engines and central turbine together produced enough power to drive her at 21 knots. Everything about her represented the latest thinking in naval architecture. Thomas Andrews had designed her. He was aboard now, taking notes on small improvements that might be made before her sister ships entered service. The White Star Line's managing director, J. Bruce Ismay, had also made the crossing, eager to see how his company's showpiece performed. Captain Edward John Smith commanded the bridge. He was 62 years old and had served Witar for decades. This would be his final voyage before retirement. The company had given him their newest and largest ship as a farewell honor. First-class passengers dined in a saloon that could seat over 500. The meals stretched to 10 or 11 courses: oysters, consume, poached salmon, felt mignon, roast duckling, lamb with mint sauce, punch roma to cleanse the palate, roast squab, cold asparagus, pâte de foie gras, Waldorf pudding, French ice cream, cheese and fruit, coffee. Each course is accompanied by appropriate wines. Dinner lasted hours. It was theater as much as sustenance. On the evening of April 14th, Captain Smith attended a dinner party hosted by the Wideners in the a la carte restaurant on B-Deck. The Wideners were Philadelphia money, old enough to be respectable. George Widner and his wife Elena had brought their son Harry, a book collector returning from a buying trip in London. Captain Smith sat at their table. According to a steward who served them, the captain talked and joked with Mr. Astor during the meal. Jack appeared content that evening. The crossing had been smooth. The weather had cooperated. In 3 more days, they would reach New York. Whatever reception awaited them there, at least the journey would be over. After dinner, some of the men retired to the smoking room for cigars and brandy. Others returned to their state heat rooms. The ship's orchestra played in the reception area near the grand staircase. A few couples danced. The night was calm, unusually calm. The sea lay flat as glass, without even the gentle swells that normally accompanied mid-Atlantic crossings. Stars filled the sky from horizon to horizon. The air had turned cold, noticeably colder than previous nights. Some passengers remarked on it. The ship had received ice warnings throughout the day. Other vessels in the area reported bergs drifting south from the Arctic. The warnings came by wireless, the new Moroni system that allowed ships to communicate across hundreds of miles of open water. Some of these messages reached the bridge. Others apparently did not. At 20 minutes before midnight, most first-class passengers had retired to their cabins. The lounges had emptied. The ship's lights blazed against the darkness as she steamed westward at nearly full speed. Malign had gone to bed early. Jack stayed up reading in their sitting room. Kitty slept nearby. The temperature outside had dropped to below freezing. The lookouts in the crow's nest strained to see what lay ahead. They had no binoculars. The sea was so still that no waves broke against obstacles to reveal them. At 11:40, Frederick Fleet spotted something in the darkness directly ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. Chapter 10. The Night. The impact woke some passengers and went unnoticed by others. A grinding shudder ran through the ship. Glasses rattled on tables. Then silence. Jack had been in the sitting room when he felt it. He sat down what he was doing and went to investigate. The corridors were quiet. A few passengers had emerged from their staterooms, looking puzzled but not alarmed. Someone mentioned ice on the forward well deck. He found Captain Smith on the bridge. The captain's expression told him more than words could. Jack asked directly. His wife was unwell. She had gone to bed. Did he need to wake her? Smith advised him to do so. They might have to take to the boats. Jack returned to their suite and woke Malign as gently as he could. He told her the ship had struck ice, but that the damage did not appear serious. They should dress warmly and put on their life belts, just as a precaution. There was no need to panic. Malign's maid, Rosalie, and her nurse, Caroline, were summoned. The women helped Malign into warm clothing while Jack dressed himself. He found extra life belts and helped fasten them. Then they made their way to the boat deck. The scene above was strange. Officers moved with purpose, uncovering lifeboats and preparing davits, but most passengers milled about in confusion. Some wore evening clothes with life belts strapped over them. Others had wrapped themselves in blankets and furs. A few laughed nervously. The band played somewhere nearby. The night air bit through their clothing. Malign shivered. Jack suggested they wait inside the gymnasium, where at least they would be out of the wind. The room was unlocked. They found seats on the mechanical riding apparatus and sat there in their lifebelts waiting. Jack remained composed. According to witnesses who saw him that night, he never raised his voice or showed fear. At one point, he found a spare lifebelt and used his penknife to cut it open. He wanted to show Malign what was inside. What would keep her afloat if it came to that cork? The belt was filled with cork. Time passed. The ship had taken on a noticeable tilt toward the bow. Whatever damage the ice had caused, it was not minor. The officers were loading lifeboats now, calling for women and children. On the boat deck, Malign noticed a young woman holding an infant. The woman was traveling in 3rd class and had somehow made her way up to the 1st class areas. She looked cold. Malign removed her own shawl and wrapped it around the baby. The woman's name was Leah Axe. Her son was called Philip, though she called him Philly. Eventually, word came that Lifeboat 4 was being loaded from a deck 1 level below. The windows on the enclosed promenade could be opened to allow passengers to step directly into the boat as it hung from the davits. Jack led Malign down. Second Officer Charles Lito. He had been struggling with the windows, which had been designed to open but were stuck from disuse or the cold. Finally, they gave way. The lifeboat swung just outside, bobbing slightly as the ship settled. Lola called for women and children. Malign's maid and nurse climbed through first. Then, it was her turn. Jack helped lift her toward the window. On the other side, hands reached to steady her as she climbed into the boat. Her balance was uncertain with the added weight she carried. Jack supported her from one side, while Archibald Gracie, another passenger, assisted from the window beside them. Once Malign was seated in the lifeboat, Jack leaned through the window. He asked Lola if he might join his wife. She was in a delicate condition, he explained. Surely an exception could be made. Lola refused. No men until all the women and children were loaded. Those were the orders. Jack did not argue. He did not demand special treatment or invoke his name or his money. He simply nodded, leaned through the window, and kissed Malign goodbye. He told her not to worry. He would find another boat. They would meet in New York. Then he stepped back from the window and watched as the lifeboat began its descent toward the dark water below. It was almost 2:00 in the morning. The bow of the Titanic had sunk so low that the sea was beginning to wash over the forward deck. The stern had risen, exposing the propellers to the night air. Jack walked back toward the boat deck. He was last seen standing with John Thier, Harry Widner, and Arthur Ryerson near the starboard rail. Some accounts say he lit a cigarette. Others say he helped with the collapsible boats that the crew was struggling to free. Maline's lifeboat reached the water at 5 minutes to 2. She looked back at the ship, searching for her husband among the figures still visible on deck. She could not find him.